So, to summarize this section, inshallah, the exploitation of colonial nations or colonized nations created a desire for independence. However, the post-colonial world was still managed in accordance to imperial interests, right? So therefore, our realities continue to be marred by the same artificial things that were created in our lands before the actual independence or division started to occur. Ethnic and religious tensions still occur throughout. Sectarianism still occurs throughout. Fear of those across the border in the instance of India and Pakistan. Ensuring that we are always bound to Western multinational institutions like the IMF as an example. Bismillah. So we move on to something called balkanization. Has anybody heard of balkanization? Anybody want to share what balkanization might be? I'll go for you. Oh no, okay. Bismillah.
You split a group of people into smaller groups of constantly fighting people.
Like the Balkans. Has anybody been to Bosnia? Okay, mashallah. Good. It's a beautiful place from what I hear. I booked to go, but COVID happened. So, inshallah, one day. Then I had a son and it becomes harder. But, alhamdulillah, best thing ever. So, balkanization. So, balkanization is a policy, right? It's actually a policy that was also referred to by Mountbatten, right? Dickie Mountbatten, yeah? Who was the guy who separated. It was the Viceroy of India, separated India and Pakistan. And it was coined after the breakdown of the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman empires, because of course these were an amalgamation of lots of different ethnicities and groups. And ultimately it was about fragmentation of large ethnically diverse regions, who are largely homogeneous, by the way, but into smaller states which are hostile and uncooperative with one another. And I'm going to give an example of this, yeah, inshallah. So this also happened in Yugoslavia. So for instance, when Yugoslavia was divided, you had a few Serbs that were in Bosnia, a few Serbs in Croatia, a few Serbs in Kosovo, a few Serbs in Macedonia. The Serbs never wanted to be there, right? They wanted to be in Serbia. And because of that, the Serbs within those populations, and I'm not saying this is a Serbian problem, if there was a few Croats in all of these areas, the same thing would have happened. They wanted to go back to their land, but they couldn't cross the border. So they started to create problems, and of course you had the Balkan Wars, and you had what happened in Bosnia that ensued, right? But this became a matter of policy, right? This became a matter of policy. And every division, or many divisions that had happened in the post-colonial period, followed this exact same pattern. So this is surgery, right? This is surgery. And, this is a guy with a mid-shaft tibial fibular fracture, and it's been, I'm not a teacher, right? But anyway, so basically, this is surgery. And surgery is very precise. Surgery is very caring. Surgery is, supposed to be very, very specific, right? And when you speak to a Brit, or when you speak to a Frenchman, and you ask them about colonial history, you might remember from your own studies when you were studying in school and, they were talking about British history, etc. They're very proud of British history. And they believe that they fixed the world. And they continue to believe that they are fixing the world, right? Even when everybody else can see that they're not fixing the world, including the people in their populations, they still hold the fact that they are fixing the world. And often the metaphor that is given in the division of India and Pakistan is that it was by surgical precision, right? Surgical precision. But there was no surgical precision when it came to the division of the subcontinent. What you had was a very nasty, a very bloody, a very gruesome division of a large piece of land with largely homogeneous people, right? Eating the same curry and the same roti and the same chawal, right? The same rice and the same chapai, right? What was ensuing in that area was a number of different problems. So the British started to blame the Muslims for the subjugation of the Hindus. They used to tell the Hindus that, look, the Muslims are subjugating you guys. The Muslims have oppressed you guys. So you need to deal with the Muslims, right? This was pre-partition. They also started to bring back in the caste system, as I mentioned. You also had the separation of communities through an act in 1935, which was the Government of India Act in 1935. So this was where the diaspora of people was officially divided into religious groups. Officially divided into religious groups. So the Sikhs can have a Sikh representative in parliament. A Muslim can have a Muslim representative in parliament. A Hindu can have a Hindu representative in parliament. The problem that creates is that starts to further subdivide the diaspora of the population. The same thing happened in Lebanon, as an example, right? And the British really do believe, or the West really do believe, that they are fixing the problem, because they see Muslims through a number of assumptions, right? There's a very famous academic called Edward Said, right, who wrote a book called Orientalism. And Orientalism is a study of the Orient, which is the Muslim world, or the East, through the prism of the West. And it's built on a number of different assumptions, right? That study is political, that study is intellectual, that study is, legislative, is a number of different studies. But here are some assumptions. Assumption number one, Muslims can't solve their problems. They can't solve their own problems, they're stupid, yeah? They really can't deal with their own affairs, right? Number two, divisions in the Muslim world have always existed, right? Like Sunni and Shia have always fought each other, right? Always. There's never been, and we got to step in to solve this, right? Number three, Muslims really can't live with any other minority people, right? So we really have to step in, right? We really have to step in, right? And because of these assumptions, we are necessary. This is what the West will say. We are necessary, right? And the same assumptions are repeated again and again and again. This is a statement of Barack Obama. The Middle East is going through a transformation, but it's rooted in conflicts that date back millennia, right? It's a very lazy look at history. And the narrative is false, right? The narrative is false. India was a very different place before partition, well, before the British and the East India Company. The Ottoman system was still the best representative, or the best way to organize minorities, right? That's attested by minorities themselves, right? A Jew can live as a Jew, has his place of worship protected, can marry according to his law, can trade according to his law, can eat according to his law, as an example, in his own enclave. And the same was with the Christian communities, as an example. So these assumptions form the basis of the narrative. So you had a lot of strife in India. You had a lot of internal strife in India. And therefore, you had a discussion. So we've got the caste system again. People are oppressing each other. Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh cannot live together, right? Cannot live together. This wasn't a conclusion that came from the ethnic people themselves. This was conclusions that was imposed on by the external. So you had a number of personalities that existed, right? Does anybody know who this guy is? Yes, Nehru, right? Does anybody know who this guy is? Yes, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Does anybody know who this guy is? Yes, Mohandas Gandhi, right? So here you are, you've got, and I'm going to say some controversial stuff, by the way, when it comes to this, right? But I'm happy to be challenged. It's not a problem, inshallah. It might be controversial, might not be. But here you are, you've got a problem that is affected or is affecting the ethnic people, the people who have lived, the people that have, traded, the people that have loved, eaten within this particular land, right? And are affected by problems that have been artificially created by the colonialists. Those who manage it are those people who were brought up, educated, right, and largely products of the same institution, right, of the exact same institution. So the solutions and the narrative and the assumptions that they will hold are going to be the same assumptions, narrative and solutions that the colonial empires were bringing to the subcontinent in the first place, right? Both Gandhi and Jinnah were Western educated lawyers, right? They both experienced secular governance with a strong Christian influence. This is common knowledge. Jinnah had very little Islam in him, right? Very little Islam in him, right? And actually Jinnah initially was a nationalist, right? He was actually in favor of a united India, right? And different academics have their take on it. Right? Anyway, he turned the corner and then he joined the All India Muslim League. Jinnah was not actually the founder of Pakistan, by the way. Does anybody know who the actual founder of Pakistan was? Nah. He was the founder of India, sorry? Allama Iqbal. Allama Iqbal was the actual founder of Pakistan. Allama Iqbal was a phenomenal man, rahmatullah alayh, and he wrote some phenomenal books and poetry. He was a master of the Arabic language, and he was a master of Farsi, right? And it's a shame that the tradition has been lost amongst the subcontinent of reading Farsi. That includes myself. But if you know a little bit of Urdu, you can appreciate what he's saying basically. And he wrote a number of powerful works that are translated that I'd really recommend you to read. They're all translated, right? The first work was something called Shikwa, right? Shikwa. So Shikwa is complaint, right? So Allama Iqbal is writing poetry, and it's a complaint from the Muslim Ummah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And it is some of the most powerful writing you ever read. It's beautiful, right? It's universal, right? And then the second part to that is Jawab, right? Jawabi Shikwa, right? Jawabi Shikwa was written by Allama Iqbal, Muhammad Iqbal, and it was written, him writing as if this is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a jawab to the Muslims, right? To the complaint, right? He's not assuming the position of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, astaghfirullah. But he's writing taking verses from the Quran and the Ahadith, that this is the response to your complaint. This is how you solve your problem. He also wrote another book, which is a very difficult book to read, but it's very powerful. It's called Decolonization of the Muslim Mind. And he talks about many of the exact same things that I've spoken about, which is that you can't carve out your future if you're still subjected to the same chains that have been bringing you down for centuries, right? You got to actually look back to your tradition, to your heritage, right? To your culture, to your Islam, in order to define for yourself a way forward. And we're going to talk about some of these personalities more in detail in the next 2 weeks, Insha'Allah. So, some of the personalities like Muhammad Iqbal, Muhammad Abduh, Jamaluddin Afghani. These were individuals that is worth paying attention to. So Iqbal was the actual intellectual founder of Pakistan, right? He was the actual intellectual founder, but Allah didn't give him enough ajal to live. He died, right? And Jinnah took over. So Jinnah actually called on partition to try and force some form of movement in parliament. However, Jinnah essentially caused, and then Jinnah essentially created, well, what Jinnah proposed then became a movement for independence. So then you had the discussion about partition. And it was getting very, very heated for the British, because you had a number of massacres that were happening because of the years of religious divide that was manufactured, and it was manufactured, right? And the rhetoric of political parties, etc. You had a number of massacres, primarily in Punjab and in Bengal, right? So this is the Bengal belt, and this is the Punjab belt. Well, just up until here, right? These are the most populated belts within the subcontinent. So you had a number of massacres, the Bengal massacres, the Great Calcutta killings, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre as an example in Punjab. These were horrific, horrific. So the British decided, okay, you know what? We're going to solve the problem. We're going to solve the problem. Yeah, we're going to fix this, fix the problem. So they decided to, step in. So this man, who is Mountbatten, right? This is Mountbatten, right? Cyril Mountbatten. Sorry, not Cyril Mountbatten. Dickie Mountbatten. And this is him sitting with Nehru and Jinnah. So Gandhi passed away and Nehru took the baton. Does anybody know who this guy is? Sorry? No. Cyril Radcliffe. Yeah, this is Cyril Radcliffe. So Mountbatten told Radcliffe that, look, I ain't got a clue about these brown people, right? I've not got a clue. We've just been leeching off their cotton and having really nice tea in our tea houses, like Betty's in Yorkshire. We've been having our tea, but we've got to sort this problem out because we're a little bit broke after the war, and also we need to get the American money, so we need to sort this out. Cyril, right? He's never been to India, right? He's never traveled India. So he gets told he's got a year to sort out, he's got 1 year to sort out this partition plan. So he's like, okay, no problem, Governor. I'll come up there in my Boeing and sort out this palaver. And then what happens? Then Mountbatten says, you know what? We ain't got a year, buddy. We've got 4 months, right? We've got 4 months. So he starts talking to Jinnah and he starts talking to Nehru, and and the discussions start ensuing, right? And then eventually you started to have this partition. And the partition was certainly quite botched, because the idea was to have Hindu majority areas to go to India and Muslim majority areas to go to Pakistan. However, you had Muslim majority Bengal, which is around here, can everyone see my pointer? Go to India, right? So Bangladesh went to Pakistan, but Bengal went to India, including areas like Assam. All of the economic capitals within the subcontinent didn't go to Pakistan, right? All of the economic capitals where the industry was, so Calcutta, Delhi, right, went to India, right? And essentially, both areas had to start off, well, Pakistan generally didn't start off from 0, started off from -100, right? Karachi, as an example, which was the first capital of Pakistan, 70% of the population was Hindu in Karachi. Yeah, so I've got lots of family in Karachi, yeah, was Hindu. After partition, that 70% was replaced. So those people that lived there, ran companies, operations, they'd left overnight. So all that industry, all of that, machinery, all of those shops, etc., they were just left empty. The economy had to start off from -100. The militaries had to be, organized, not by them, but by British generals, right? So the British were like, we're going to leave, but we're not actually going to leave, right? So they started to organize the militaries, right? They started to organize the militaries. India really got the better deal. I mean, Nehru got India, and this is common news. This is known. He also got Mountbatten's wife, yeah, because he got both, right? So he got a better deal. Jinnah got Pakistan without any economic capital, loss of industry, mass displacement of people. So it starts off from -100. But they accepted it. They accepted the proposal, right? They accepted the proposal. But this was tumultuous. Does anybody know how many people died in this period?
1 million.
1 million. Just in migration. 1 million people died.
Not just in Punjab.
That was just in Punjab. That's correct. That was just in Punjab. And because, you know, the borders weren't even announced on the day. People didn't know what was Pakistan, what was India. Right? Independence, everybody was celebrating, but they had no idea whether they were standing in India or in Pakistan. So they had to flee. And it's horrific, some of the stories. So you had countless deaths. Both countries had to start again in terms of military and economic. And the most ironic thing is, they were divided in a way that they would always be, you know, at odds with each other. They were divided in a way that they will always be consumed with the existence of the other. And we call that patriotism, right? Patriotism. When you're patriotic, you see your cause as something that is inherent to your survival as people, right? The Pakistanis cannot think outside of India. They can't imagine anything outside of India and Afghanistan, yeah, locally. And the Indians cannot, actually, the ironic thing is the Indians can imagine things outside of Pakistan. They've actually moved on, and I'll come to that in a second. They've actually moved on. And the issue that remains is Kashmir. The issue that remains is Kashmir. Is anybody from Indian occupied Kashmir? So you, sister, you're from both. Okay, have you got parents from both sides? Or? Okay, mashallah, tabarakallah. So this is what I call the Palestine of the subcontinent. Right? This is the Palestine of the subcontinent. Everything we spoke about last session, of course, this has been happening with the Palestinians. There have been, alhamdulillah, activists, alternative media, etc. With the Kashmiris, there's no media, right? There's no electricity at times. So you don't actually know what's going on behind the world. Kashmir is the world's most militarized zone. The world's most militarized zone, right? And, you know, the amount of deaths and subjugation of people is incredible. It's incredibly bad. Essentially, during partition, you had a Maharaja who was a Hindu Maharaja, right? It's a Hindu Maharaja. And the Maharaja was given a choice. He was one of the few Maharajas that were given a choice, by the way, yeah? And nobody can explain why these people were given a choice, but he was given a choice. Do you want to be with Pakistan or do you want to be with India? Now, when the discussion about partition was happening, you had 3 independent revolts against the Maharaja. From the majority Muslim population that said that they wanted to be with Pakistan. This is known fact. Yeah, because that was the deal that they were given. The Maharaja took help from India in order to quell the rebellions, right? 1931, 1947, and the Jammu massacre of 47. So the Indians gave him help. So in exchange for that, the Maharaja told the British that we want to be with India, right? So India decided to annex Kashmir. But that was to the contrary of the people that were living there. Not just Muslims, by the way. The Hindus that was living there as well. The Pandits, yeah? The Hindus that were living there too, right? They didn't want to be under Indian rule, right? Because they had, like I said, ethnically homogeneous people. They've lived for centuries together, right? Partition is the last thing they want, right? So they wanted to go with the majority. We know that Kashmir is very difficult for Kashmir to exist independently. Very difficult, yeah? The Economist did a very, very good analysis many years ago on Kashmir, yeah? Kashmir is A, landlocked, B, Kashmir has very historical trade links with Pakistan, right? There is more cultural homogeneity with Pakistanis, as an example. And there is a majority Muslim population, right? Majority Muslim population, right? But whether independence or not is not necessarily my call. But historically, we know that the call was to join with Pakistan at the time. But this was against the wishes of the Pakistani people. So then you had the UN Security Council Resolution 47 in 1948, right? Security Council Resolution. So, and you had a number of different wars and resolutions after that particular period. And I want to explain a little bit of the demographics of Kashmir on the next slide. Because what's happening now is that there is continuous defaulting on the issue of Kashmir to Resolution 47. Resolution 47 essentially says that the Kashmiris have a right to decide, whatever that is, where they want to be. That's their right. Right? But the resolution says that they should be, I can't remember, the word starts with P, yeah? But it essentially means a vote. Yeah? That's it, a plebiscite. There needs to be a vote. India has never allowed that vote to occur. Pakistan's argument is that the annexation was an illegal annexation because the people of Kashmir did not want to side with India. That's Pakistan's argument. But as a result of the fact that the issue was not solved during partition, there has been bloodshed. There has been bloodshed. And that's not because the British were incapable of sorting this issue out at the time. It's because, just like with Palestine, the occupying entity exists to ensure that there is perpetual conflict on that border. In the same way, the issue of Kashmir is left undecided to ensure that there's perpetual conflict on that border. And history is testament to that. You've had a number of wars as a result. And nobody else suffers except for the people of Kashmir. Except for the people of Kashmir. Yeah? And when you see the videos of the Kashmiris giving their take, you can't blame them. They say, we're made into pawns on a regional conflict that should have been solved in 1947, basically. Yeah, it should have been solved. Kashmir today. Kashmir today. Yeah? You had the introduction of something called, or the revocation of Article 370 and Article 35A. Does anybody know what those articles are?
It gives Kashmir autonomous status that they can govern themselves except for military and so on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's more than that. It's autonomous status so that they can decide on, a number of issues about governance. It's also permits, right? It's property permits, yes, sister.
Just about the previous slide, you said India hasn't allowed them to vote. How did they go about making a vote? And also,
So I'll explain. So this article explains some of it. Yeah. So this article explains some of it, sister. So the deal was that India becomes part of Kashmir, but has its own, not legislative, because they don't make necessarily legislation, but it has its own governing authority. But it's still it's still subjected to the Indian state. Very similar to the Deccan, which is South India, right? South Indians in Kerala, who are very different to North Indians, by the way, have their own a municipal government, as an example, right? They have their own councils, but they're ultimately under the tutelage and, under the state of India, as an example. And actually, this was seen as a positive model for other minority communities that wanted to separate themselves and have some form of independence from India, the central state. For example, in Assam, yeah, where a lot of your tea comes from, as an example. So, however, this was revoked, right? And this was revoked by a government, which is the BJP government, and we'll talk about the BJP government in a second, inshallah. So all of a sudden, so the right and the ability to decide your own politics in terms of where funding goes to, etc., is revoked. Also, your ability to decide who owns property and who doesn't own property is also revoked, right? In other words, Kashmir becomes fair game for anybody. In addition to that, Kashmir becomes further split, right, in terms of who has the right to vote and not. So Kashmir, for example, is split into Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh, right? The Kashmir Valley, as an example, constitutes 55% of the entirety of the population, right? 97% of the population is Muslim, right, in Kashmir Valley. The remaining about, let's just call it 44%, 43%, is in Jammu, which is 66% Hindu. And then that's split into the north and the south, yeah? And then you have Ladakh, which is 50% Muslim, right? Very small population, about 500,000 people, yeah? 50% of those are Muslims, yeah? So the 66% of the state is Muslim, that's one thing, right? And the majority of the state does not want India to step on its toes. However, despite that, that's unfortunately and essentially happened. So you had further division, and this is what this shows. You had further division of Kashmir into two provinces, right? You had a complete revamp of how voting works in Kashmir. And on the ground, this has a number of repercussions for people in Kashmir. So you have arbitrary detention of people. You can just be arrested, right? You can, for example, you have communication blackouts, weekly in Kashmir, as an example. Arbitrary arrests, right? People being taken, returned in body bags. Yeah, this is the reality of Kashmir. Yeah, and you have a number of different laws that are centrally imposed that justify these things. The Unlawful Activities Prevention Act that basically just gives somebody to just blame someone as a terrorist, giving them entire right to completely search their home, take them away. So Ajay Shukla, who's a political analyst, he said, doing away with Article 370 now opens the door for an open Palestine-type independent struggle within Kashmir. And even now, what you have, when you go to India, when you travel India, and when you look at the adverts, you have adverts about buying land and buying property in Kashmir, right? It's no different to settler colonialism. It's no different to the settler movements of the Zionists within Palestine, right? And that's the fear with Kashmir. But ultimately, the situation was not solved, was left to hang in thin air or on a thread. And as a result of that, you have a perpetual conflict that ensues in Kashmir. And all of this is under the political rise of an organization known as the BJP. The BJP is the political wing of an organization called the RSS, which was established around 1930s, 1935, which actually sought inspiration from Adolf Hitler. And the idea behind the RSS is the fact that Muslims and Sikhs are not Indian enough, right? So it's a hardcore Hindu nationalism. And their members exist in the UK, by the way, right? Does anybody remember this Leicester riots? Yeah? So it's not just an Indian thing. So, for example, so my family are from Gujarat, right, in India, right? Gujarat is 60 million in terms of population. 3 to 4% is Muslim. So I had family that were involved in the Gujarat riots, right? Which was a riot that killed over 3 days about 2,000 Muslims, right? That happened under the auspices and the control of Narendra Modi, who is the current PM of the state of India. And you've had loads of other things. If you're a Muslim, you're not allowed to wear hijab at school and at universities. There was this whole mantra of something called love jihad, which sounds so dead, right? Like, what the hell, yeah? It's this whole idea that Muslims are marrying Hindus, making them Muslims. right? It's a whole kind of, you know, it's part of their religion to marry Hindu women and make them into Muslims. It sounds ridiculous, but the people believe it because they are affected and believe in a hardcore version of Hindu nationalism, right? You have, for example, Muslims and Sikhs being subjugated to violence, right? Right? And being forced to say statements contrary to their belief, right? There's videos of this, yeah? You can see it on Twitter. They get beaten up, right? They get beaten up and they're told, you know, to say words of kind of like, you know, Hindu prayers, etc. You have, you know, overtly racist, Islamophobic, whatever you call it, legislation. For example, in 2019, the Sikhs, Christians, and Jains from surrounding countries who want to seek asylum can do that, no problems. They can become citizens, no problems, but Muslims can't. Even those Muslims who have a cultural heritage or cultural link to the land, there's no right of return for them, right? And that's why this picture is pretty telling of Bibi Netanyahu and Narendra Modi. This is the reality of India today. Pakistan. So the modern world, if you remember this slide, these are the ideas that became the assumptions behind the modern world. Religion and the state are to be separated. Nation states are better than pan-national empires. Individualism is the bedrock of society, and minorities are always best represented in democratic governance. And these are the various faces and personalities that have inspired, you know, Pakistan today. That's Iqbal, right? Does anybody know who this is? Yeah, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Zia ul Haq, Hamid Ali Jinnah, Imran Khan, right? Imran Khan. You know, in India, you know, Muslims in India, yeah, they really seek inspiration from Pakistan. Yeah, if you go to, for example, in Mumbai, yeah, if you go to Mumbai, you drive through Mumbai, you have graffiti of Pakistani flags in Mumbai. You will have graffiti of rockets, interestingly, that say Ghaznavi, right? Mahmud al-Ghaznavi, yeah, who's a famous conqueror, right? You will have, you know, lots of chanting, even when it comes to cricket, right? They have to be silent about it, but there's a lot of Indian Muslims living in India that support Pakistan in cricket, right? You've got to be silent about it, but it's true. In other words, for the Muslim that lives in India, the Indians really do follow what's happening in Pakistan. So there are a lot of similarities and there are a lot of problems that have occurred in Pakistan today that explain the situation that it is in today. And I want to just unpack some of them quickly. When I say India has moved on, India has certainly moved on. The reason why India has moved on is that, yes, India has adopted Hindu nationalism, for sure, but it has wholeheartedly adopted secular governance, right? Liberal secular governance. And it has decided to move on that basis. That's why it's one of the largest growing economies in the world. The issue with Pakistan historically throughout its existence is that it has never quite decided what it stands for. It has never quite decided what it stands for. Jinnah and Khan have very similar upbringings. They're both from relatively plush backgrounds. They're both educated in the West. And they were both somewhat inspired by the political writings of some Muslim philosophers, right? But there is no real difference in the politics, in the sense that it's never been clear what they stand for. Jinnah's first speech, he said, there is no difference between a Hindu and a Muslim, not in the religious sense, but in the secular sense, right? So the call for Pakistan was a place for Muslims to live by their Islam, but the basis of the establishment of Pakistan was, we're going to be a secular country. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto said something very famous. He said, Islam is our faith, democracy is our politics, and socialism is our economy. All power to the people. Right? So one man tells you that we're secular, the other man tells you that we're also socialist, by the way. And then Imran Khan comes and he says, you know, I'm seeking inspiration through the Medinan state, right? Riyasat al-Medina, right? In other words, what you have is a quagmire of competing, contradictory ideas that have defined the course of Pakistan over the past few decades. Pakistan is unable to look beyond India. That's always been its problem. It cannot look beyond India, right? And India couldn't look beyond Pakistan, but now looks beyond Pakistan. Pakistan is not India's biggest problem. Do you know what India's biggest problem is? China. China is India's biggest problem, right? And that's not because India thinks it's its biggest problem. It is partly, but it's because America uses India to neutralize China, right? It's very clear, right? But India has largely moved on, right? Pakistan's politics has always been centered on the region, India and Afghanistan. And what's happening with the Afghani population at the moment in Pakistan is very sad, right? I'm not sure if you've seen the exodus. Absolutely. That's why Pakistan has been silent on many Muslim issues. For example, the Uyghur Muslim issue, right? For example, even the Afghani state, the Taliban that it once supported, right? There is no, and there hasn't been, a translational strategy from Pakistan, right? There's never been a translational strategy, right? There's never been, this is what's going to happen, this is what my political project is. And there is an element that the translation has not been allowed to happen because of the military. There is that element. But the people don't know what Pakistan stands for. That's the fundamental problem. You ask an American, what does America stand for? Even if he's a uneducated Texan guy, he will tell you what America stands for. You ask, Dave from, South London, what does Britain stand for? He will tell you, Mike, we stand for democracy. Yeah, we stand for human rights. Yeah, sorry? No, it's not. It's actually a Cockney accent, Mike. What are you talking about? Anyway, so he says, what a joking. So he says, so he's very clear, even though he's uneducated, he's very clear about what his state stands for. And the Pakistani will say, La ilaha illallah. I think he will just say La ilaha illallah because that's the statement, right? But that has no translational meaning on the everyday actions of Pakistan. They can't see it, right? And that's fundamentally, and always has been, the fundamental problem of the state of Pakistan. As a result of it, it's never been able to come out of its problems. Because the country doesn't know what it stands for, it doesn't know which direction it will take. I remember watching a Pakistani drama. My mum's proper into these, yeah? Right, anybody from the subcontinent will know this, yeah? There's a drama. And the guy, long story short, the guy basically gets married to this woman. He's very poor, and his wife gets employed by this rich guy, and she cheats on him. That's what happens. Yeah, man, it's bad. It's bad. But he wins, by the way. He wins. I mean, it depends on how you see it. He wins. Because then he's like, you know what? They've got a kid as well, that's what makes it worse. But anyway. And he says, I'm going to sort my act, I'm going to get rich. So he gets rich. And dramas and popular culture there's always an agenda behind it. So he doesn't get rich by toiling and going through a factory and working or starting a business. He has these fancy shots of the Pakistani stock exchange, right? And it's like, you know what, we're going to go to this Pakistani stock exchange, right? And I'm going to like do some like, you know, stocks buying and selling of stocks, right? And then he does that, and then he gets really rich, right? So the whole idea is to show the people, yeah, that there is a stock exchange and you can deposit your money. That's because it's trendy to do. And it's because people in the West are doing it, and also international institutions such as the IMF is telling countries, not just Pakistan, but other countries, to design their economies in a particular way, which only benefits them in the end. Because it's ironic, because the average man in Pakistan does not deal with like a Monzo credit card, right? He deals in cash, right? The average guy in Pakistan deals in cash, right? The average person in India and Pakistan does not have a bank account, right? How are they going to buy a stock and share? Pakistan has one of the youngest populations in the world, right? And I'm sure they're not just good at, you know, making footballs and cricket bats, yeah? Because that was industry. But you can utilize that industry, you can utilize that population to create a very, very strong, robust economy. But all of that thinking is absent. It's just absent, right? It's absent from all levels of institutions, including, and I'm not saying none of these people were sincere, right? None of these people are sincere, but sincerity, there's more to just sincerity in politics. It requires thought and having a political mind. I think somebody had a question or somebody raised their hand. Of the quote? Strife, yes. Ethnic strife. So somebody said, but if somebody has to go to the ICU 23 times, then something is wrong with the overall treatment plan. And this is the IMF.
So you said earlier, you know, there's a lot of Indians in somewhere like Mumbai who would support Pakistan in
Amen.
Does that not mean in a way that the BJP and the RSS are right to receive that Indian Muslim part?
In some ways it holds true. In some ways it holds true. Because for a long time the Indian political medium was trying to create a unified Indian identity. So you've got the BJP and you've got Congress. And that was their politics, you know, what it means to be an Indian, you know, etc., etc. But it's not that Muslims and the Muslim population never played tune to that. It was more the fact that the other segments of society, such as the RSS, who are a grassroots organization, never allowed the Hindus to accept the Muslims. And that's as a result of decades of a narrative that says, don't let these Muslims get better than you, because otherwise they're going to do to you what they did centuries ago. And I'm not just saying this, but academics have said this. The most prosperous or prosperity in Indian history came under Mughal rule, right? It was the richest, it was the most colorful, it had the most amount of produce. It was when culture truly came to life, right? But that's the way the people see the Muslims at that time. So Muslims have no choice because the state is not representing them, so they've got to find that representation from somewhere else. So I want to speak about the IMF before I move to the last part, inshallah. So, and this can be read about, but the IMF is another international or multinational institution that has created a number of problems for the Muslim world. Pakistan, for example, took recently, in July 2023, a $1 billion loan with a standby of $3 billion. In 2019, it took $6 billion as an IMF loan. And it's not just the fact that you're taking a loan. You're paying the loan back with interest, but there are conditions attached to that loan which force a country to change the way it operates in order to not just pay back the loan. The reality is you'll never pay back the loan, but in order to benefit Western multinational companies. I'm not going to go through the examples because there's so many, but Africa is still in a quagmire of debt, a cycle of debt, reduced wages and unemployment, with drugs and mercenaries becoming, the real economy in some of those places. Ecuador took a loan as an example. But there are some details, but we can speak about those later.
Where could we find some of these conditions?
I can send some articles out, inshallah. So, just give you a stat. The GDP of Pakistan as of last week is 376 billion. It has a population of 240 million people. That's the same amount of GDP as Hong Kong, who has a population of 7 million people. Right? The disparity is crazy. Right? So for the latest loan, the condition is you've got to hike your taxes, so the average man suffers even more, right? And it's not just, and the interest rates that they need to pay back on is raised even more. It's 22% is the interest rate, by the way, for this loan, right? Which is crazy. That's a lot of interest. And there's loads of other examples. Africa, you know, coffee beans and instant coffee, right? Coffee beans and instant coffee. I'm just going to give you guys an example. Coffee beans, a lot of them come from places like South America. Not much the Caribbean, but South Middle East, yeah. South Middle East, yeah. Sorry? Turkey. Yeah, I don't think they come from Turkey. Yeah, I don't think they come from Turkey. Ethiopia, yeah, Ethiopia, etc. Yeah, and actually a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, right, grows coffee. Yeah. Now when you grow coffee versus instant coffee, okay, what processes does coffee need to go through on a mass level to make instant coffee? Okay, grinding. So you need a grinder. Roasting. You need a roaster first. You need a grinder. Anything else? You need a washer. You need somebody that washes the coffee beans. Yes. You need a sifter to sift the old from the new. What else happens? I'll answer that now, inshallah. So you need a sifter. You need somebody that packages it. You need somebody that processes orders. You need somebody that delivers it. So that's potentially about 9 jobs just in a line of coffee, right? Just in creating coffee. That's potentially 9 jobs. If you have a factory of them, that's hundreds of jobs. But what happens with these structural adjustment programs? The coffee is grown and it's sent straight to the West. So all that potential employment, down the drain. People don't have money. People can't eat. So what do? They start to get involved in drugs. They start to get involved in mercenary warfare. They start to basically sell weapons. And there's loads of movies about these things, yeah? These are real lives. It's a good question. I'm afraid I'm not an economist, so I can't give you a complete, comprehensive answer to that, based on economics. However, the first thing is to discover what your resources are, and that's the point. The final section is something called, didn't come out right, but sectarianization. Sectarianization. Once again, the main issue in the 7th century struggle over who is the rightful heir to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Sunnis or Shia, defines the Arab world today. That is the claim, and it's called and we call this sectarianization. So therefore, the assumption here is that division amongst Muslims is inevitable and is as a result of a century-long historical divide. In fact, King Abdullah of Jordan made a reference to, the sectarian world, and he coined something called the Shia crescent. Yeah? Has anybody heard of the this term called the Shia crescent, yeah? And I'll show you a picture of it. So this is the Shia crescent. So the idea is that the problems in the Muslim world can be defined and can be put down to a centuries-long problem between Sunni and Shia. And it's not just Sunni and Shia, it could be Salafism and Sufism, right? It could be, Ash'ariism and Atharism, right? It could be any construct, but the sectarian nature of Muslims is the main cause, the principal cause for why there is conflict in the Muslim world, right? And there are a number of sectarianized conflicts, right? For example, the Saudis, Saudi Arabia versus the Houthis in Yemen, right? Bahrain, when the Saudis supported the Khalifa family, right, in order to quell the Arab Spring, which was primarily of a Shia background. Hezbollah's support for Assad in the Syrian civil war, or the Syrian war. And even sectarianism at home, right? People not being able to marry because one person's, one person wipes, I won't give examples, but there's so many examples, right? So it transfers through every level of society, affects us even at home. So, let me just have a look at and these are just some examples of sectarianism. The reality is that, for instance, sectarianism is very different to politics. So, for example, a working class person in Britain is very likely to vote, historically, Labour, because he or she felt that Labour represents the working class person the best, right? Now, what happened in the Muslim world, or in the Arab world, and the Muslim world in particular, was that minority groupings were created overnight. Right? Minority groupings were created overnight, and we've discussed this already. You had the division of lands, and you had the creation of new countries out of thin air. The previous to this, Muslims were not used to living under national or sectarian identities. The world was kind of created whereby the state would be representing a religion, right? So Islam is your identity, or Christianity is your identity, right? Or Hinduism is your identity. And that was how our heritage has always functioned. Overnight, we were then made to discard that. We were to discard that and to start to create new identities. And everybody wanted to create or have a stake from their political structure, whether it's Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, etc. So for instance, what does it mean to be a Libyan? Right? People started asking these questions. What does it mean to be Yemeni? What does it mean to be Kuwaiti? Right? What does it mean to be, Maronite? What does it mean to be all of these different things? This happened overnight. People then started to become very, very paranoid, because they felt, okay, you know what? We're living in a land where the majority people are X group. Therefore, we need to define ourselves and be strong on our sectarian identity, right? And the reality of sectarianism is that it's often a means by which a country hides its own structural failures, right? It actually results, or is as a result of when people are not treated as citizens and as people, but they're treated as, groupings, whether they have domestic influence or foreign influence. And we know that sects exist in Islam. We know that sects exist in Islam, right? Sects are natural in Islam, by the way. They will naturally occur, right? Because everybody has different human capacity. That's one thing, right? It's affirmed by the Quran. It's affirmed by the ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You will be in sects. It's not like we are not elusive to this. There will be sects. There will be differences in understanding. Quran talks about muhkam ayat and mutashabih ayat. People will have different readings of different texts. People will have different understandings. Yeah.
You mean schools of thoughts or sects?
Sects.
You're saying sects?
Yeah,
or
sects. Sects. I'll explain, yeah. So, I'll explain inshallah. But that's more of a detailed conversation. I can go into that in a bit more detail later. But there will be different groupings, right? There will be different groups. This is affirmed, right, by Quran and Hadith, right? However, and these existed through our history, right? These existed throughout our history. And there was a number of difficult political moments throughout our history as well. For example, the Mihna of Imam Ahmad, right, with the Mu'tazila, the Fatimids, who were Ismaili Shi'i, right, the Ottomans versus the Safavids, right. However, when it came to certain instances, Islam also gives us an ability to decipher when collaboration is allowed and when collaboration is not allowed. Who is within the fold of Islam and who is not within the fold of Islam, right? Who is within the fold of Islam and who is not within the fold of Islam. Islam gives us clear guidelines on this, right? And this is how we've always functioned, right? This is how we've always functioned. However, all of that was done with overnight. Sectarianization is when you implement policies purposefully to foster divisions amongst people based on a sectarian identity, right? So, and is often done to hide a state's failure. And this happens in different ways, as an example, right? I remember going to Lebanon, in Beirut. I remember walking through an area which was considered to be a Shia area, as an example, yeah? I remember walking through that. And then there was like loads of like propaganda, right? It's like loads of propaganda, yeah? And then I walked through the Sunni area, and then I saw like, does anybody watch the Omar series? Yeah. Which was on NBC. I saw posters of the Omar series. Omar series came out like 2-3 years ago, but it was because it said Omar on it, yeah? Omar bin Khattab, right? Right? So, they say in Lebanon, they say in Lebanon, by the way, yeah? They say an atheist in Lebanon has to tell somebody that he's either Maronite, Druze, Sunni or Shia to have a voice in politics. Right? The sect becomes your political identity, is the point here. Right? You have the exploitation of minority groups in order to push political agendas. So for example, the Alawis, who are a minority grouping within Syria, are in charge of a majority Sunni population, right? For example, the Coptic Christians in Egypt, right, are always used as political fodder for the regime in Egypt. Oh, we're rooting out these people in order to, protect our minorities, right? Sectarianization is the basis of politics in the Muslim world, right? It's the basis of politics. And it's taken advantage of, right? It's taken advantage of. Because when you've had wars in these countries, these groups that actually existed in many places quite peacefully, whilst understanding their theological differences, because there are theological differences, yeah? Theological differences, but they were still able to function, they were still able to, live together. Overnight, those differences were sectarianized. A very good example is Iraq, right? Saddam Hussein was Sunni. He blew the trumpet of Sunniism. Right? I've been to his palace, yeah? His old palace, yeah? In Iraq. And he blew lots of trumpets, yeah? Of himself. But he was all about, I'm representing the Sunnis, right? And that created a lot of problems within places like Baghdad, which is a quagmire and a mix of lots of different minority groups, right? As a result of the Iraq war, you have had a sustained separation of Iraq into clear demarcated Sunni areas and clear demarcated Shia areas, which did not exist to the same extent that they existed pre-war, right? And even pre-Saddam Hussein. Another example is Syria, where Iran says that it's coming to the help of the Assad regime on a Shia basis, right? We're going to come and represent the Shia. But where was Iran when people in Azerbaijan, who is a majority Shia country, when they were undergoing a civil war and lots of strife? Saudi Arabia says that we went into Bahrain and we're going into Yemen in order to, consolidate Sunnism. Where was Saudi Arabia in Syria? Where's Saudi Arabia in Palestine? Right? So the mantra, and this mantra is not just political, it is also with, scholars, it is also in your own khutbahs. I remember a few years ago, right? The New Year's Day khutbah in my local masjid. I'm not going to say the name of the masjid, yeah? My local masjid. And New Year's Day is when the youth come, and it's a perfect time when you can really gather the youth. The khutbah was on why all of the Shia are kuffar. Wallahi. Wallahi, that was the khutbah. And that wasn't just the khutbah, that was the orchestrated khutbah in the whole of the area. That was the orchestrated khutbah in the whole of the area, right? Sectarianization as politics creates division on every single level, right? On every single level. And I think I've explained some of these things already, Insha'Allah. So ultimately, and in conclusion, we're still marred by colonial structures and their views about our politics, right? We were separated on their terms. We govern on their terms. We structure our economies on their terms. We identify with each other on their terms. Even think about the label of extremism, right? When somebody says that you're an extreme Muslim and you're not an extreme Muslim, we've never actually thought what is extreme with regards to Islam. We define it based on the rhetoric that somebody else has given us. It's therefore important for us as Muslims to move beyond these constructs that have been imposed on us, right? Look towards unifying forces within reason, which is the Islamic Aqidah, and defining our vital issues, Palestine, etc., which is a vital issue at the moment, and clarity is important. Ultimately, Western powers have always sought to perpetuate patriotism and sectarianization in our societies. And that's purely for continued exploitation of the blood and the sweat of our brothers and sisters, including us. So we have to be ummah-centric, right? We can't let these labels divide us and define us, right? We're part of the Muslim ummah. هذه أمتكم أمة واحدة وأنا ربكم فاعبدون. This is an ummah, this is one ummah, and I am your Lord, so worship me. We must look to our political situation and recognize what we are, our problems, and what we want to become on our own terms, inshallah. So I'm going to open it up to questions, inshallah.
Sects that they didn't agree with at all, and then the ones that they were fine with.
So the Ottomans, the way the Ottomans dealt with them in the way that any Muslim would deal with somebody who's not particularly of their persuasion. Differences in Islam in terms of theology, etc. This is a long conversation, but have evolved over time. but it's about finding a way in which you can differentiate whether somebody is Muslim or non-Muslim, because it has repercussions, yeah? Repercussions of hudud, repercussions of irtidad, right? So apostasy, repercussions on taxation, repercussions on zakat. Who is eligible for zakat and who is not eligible for zakat. So therefore, having clear parameters to define who is Muslim and not a Muslim is incredibly important, yeah? And this takes into account the whole idea about sects. Because we know that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us about the multiplicity of sects in Islam, right? But he also caveated that, and he said one of them will enter Jannah, right? Enter Jannah, right? And you have different narrations on that. And there's an extensive commentary on what is a sect and what is not a sect. But ultimately, bil consensus, it's a sect is somebody who disagrees, right? So to identify who a sect is, you've got to look at who the sects were at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So you have to look at the Jews and you have to look at the Christians. How did they define themselves as sects, right? And they defined themselves as sects based on clear-cut theological matters, right? So for example, the Catholics, they believe in an additional number of books in the Bible compared to the Protestants, as an example, yeah? In the same respect, you know, the Jews, for example, differed with regards to scriptures, yeah, the Talmud and Tanakh, etc., right? So in the same way, if somebody denies the finality of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then they're outside of the fold of Islam. That's quite clear, right? But if somebody holds a position of you, from you, as an example, that's based on, you know, something that is in usul is called dhann, yeah, it's called ghalabat al-dhann, yeah. So something that is doubtful, right? Then if they've got evidence, then they have a position of shubha dalil, right? So they have a position of weak evidence. So you may disagree with their position. You may not necessarily do what they do, right? But they have an evidential standard behind their opinion, despite being weak, and therefore it is an accepted Islamic opinion, right? Within that. So the Ottomans evaluated the various different Muslim groupings that were present within their society, and therefore looked at, okay, who's clearly outside of the fold of Islam, right? And who may not necessarily agree with us, but is still within the fold of Islam, right? And therefore defined who is jizyable and who is not jizyable, if that makes sense. Who is to pay zakat and who is not to pay zakat. Who is to be, you know, the laws of apostasy to be applied and who is not the laws of apostasy. Do you see? Having clear parameters allows a state to function. If it's not like that, if we're airy-fairy about it, it becomes very problematic. Inshallah. You were first, actually.
So what sects would you say are present in modern day?
That's not for me to talk about, bro. As in, so, I mean, so the thing is, it has to be taken by case-by-case basis, right? And if you want a particular judgment on who is Muslim and who is not, it's not something for the Am to do, including myself, by the way, yeah? I'm just giving you the general landscape, inshallah. So that each case has to be evaluated with regards to its basis, right? And really the framework is what constitutes, from an evidential level, something that is a qat'i position, what constitutes a dhanni position. If somebody, for example, says that nubuwwah should have come to somebody else, they're clear cut, right? If somebody, for example, says, the Sahaba, as an example, are non-Muslim. Yeah? If somebody says that, yeah, this is not us latching onto certain Sahaba. This is an issue of ijma'. You're basically saying that the ijma' of the Sahaba is wrong, right? That is clear cut outside fold of Islam, right? So it's based on the qat'iyat. However, right? Ala ragm min, yeah? So if somebody says, for example, that for example, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, yeah, is, I don't know, let's give some different examples, yeah. If somebody, for example, says, that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is made out of a part of the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Somebody says this, yeah. Somebody says this, controversial, right? Controversial. You got to look into the argument. I don't believe that personally, right? I don't believe that, but you got to look into the argument, right? And I'll leave it to you guys to look, but they have reasons why, right? They have reasons why. And some of the ahadith that they use, some would class as da'if, some would class as, you can do tajamma of adillat as an example. It's multifaceted. That's why it's not for the average person to do, if that makes sense, right? It requires a grounding of usul, of the Arabic language first of all, an understanding of the various levels of evidences. You have to have some form of understanding of how to do tarjih of opinions, and also ilm al-rijal in terms of the types of people. And then you can come to a conclusion about a particular person or individual.
Can I follow up?
Yes.
So, because when you kind of described the sects, you said at the time of Prophet ﷺ,
Sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
you almost made it seem like each religion was a different sect.
Like you saying it as if you were like, it was like Islam advocates.
No.
If you're saying that we have to look at the time of Prophet ﷺ,
Yes.
Christianity, Judaism,
Yes.
all the other pagan
Yes.
religions, for example,
Yes.
Islam,
Yes.
then how would you kind of
I'll explain
go
that.
through the idea of like Islam?
I can explain that.
Have sects come about.
I can explain that. So
You said that it kind of sounded like you were like endorsing.
yeah, sorry.
Is it that narration? I think it's a narration where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Rasul that there's 3 different types of punishment that could be from the Ummah, the sky, the division into sects, and the Rasul says that's the lightest.
Yeah. So that's a narration that is often used, yeah? So the point that I was making was that when you look at, for instance, when you look at the time of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because the hadith has to be read in accordance to his time, yeah? When you look at Christians and when you look at Jews, they differed on things that were qat'iyat, right? That were definitive, right? Definitively established by their text, yeah? And they became sects. The Ummah, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that the Ummah would divide into sects too. The point that I'm making is that we need to differentiate between what is a sect and what is not a sect, right? And there has to be clear parameters with regards to that. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has already told us that we're going to divide, right? It's not new information, yeah? And I'm saying the reason for those divisions is that, and I'm not justifying them, yeah? So I'm saying the reasons is that people have different human capacities, right? People understand things in different ways. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke about ayat mutashabih, ayat muhkam, right? And he basically said that those people who have zayg in their heart are going to be like, how do I translate zayg? Like corruption in their heart are going to be going towards the ayat mutashabih. In other words, these things are going to be inevitable. What is the role of the Muslim? The Muslim needs to clearly be able to identify who is Muslim and who is not Muslim, right? Who you're able to call your brother, who is not your brother, right? You know, who seeks to, enhance you and who seeks to destroy you, right? And those lines have to be clear. They have to be clear cut. Otherwise, as you can see on a political level, you might be applying punishments to people who there should be no punishment for, if that makes sense. You might be excommunicating somebody, right, who is not to be excommunicating, right? You might not feel sympathy for a Muslim because you see them as not Muslim, but in reality they are Muslim. It has repercussions. That was my point.
Is this the way like the words get confused me?
I apologize, inshallah. I apologize. Is that clear? Okay, inshallah. We can talk about it later, inshallah. Oh no, actually, sister at the back did.
I just got a question about pan-nationalism.
Mm.
You refer to that, are you referring to like all Muslim nations existing as an ummah, or is there like a place for, like, what do you mean by that? What are the negatives kind of?
Yeah, so that's an interesting space. That's an evolving space. Yeah. So the evolving space is okay. Nation states have failed Muslims. That's consensus. Yeah, amongst Muslim political thinkers, nation states have failed us. So therefore, what's the alternative? Historically, it was a caliphate. Yeah, it was a khilafah, and it existed for 1400 years. Right. One discussion is okay. Is there a need for another khilafah, or are we seeking for some form of pan-national kind of, unification, pan-national kind of, organization, etc., etc. I'm not really in that space. Yeah, I do keep in touch with that space, but I'm not qualified to give an opinion on that. But this is a live conversation that's happening. If you want to see that, inshallah, there is an organization called Ummatics, which is run by a professor called Ovamir Anjum. Right, Ummatics, and they do some brilliant work, right? And their area is they're a think tank and their area is knowledge production. So they look at a number of different case studies and they're trying to define, okay, therefore how should the Muslim world organize, right? In a way that, that is productive and not in a way that is unproductive, basically. Yeah.
You mentioned that in the new Saudi order, that Saudi deal are converts, but how Jerusalem became the new capital.
Yeah.
I didn't understand the significance.
So it is quite significant because Jerusalem was always supposed to not be in the hands of anybody. It was supposed to be something that was administered according to UN Resolution 181, according to, it's supposed to be looked after by Jordan, right? But it was supposed to be a neutral zone, right? Undecided on. The fact that it was decided on very clearly showed whose side the West was on. That was the significance. And for the Palestinians, that was a massive issue. Because of course for Al-Quds is Al-Quds, right? It's the most, it's the third holiest place on this earth. So I hope that makes sense. We'll go for one question, inshallah.
It was just clarification on some of the things that are in the program.
Yeah.
The first one was just a general question. If Jinnah, he didn't have any Islam in him, then what was the reasoning behind collecting all the Muslims together, and why didn't he do it in a strategic way where they'd get at least some form?
Well, the thing is, I don't know about the later period of his life. I can only comment on the earlier period of life and what is known. But it was known that Jinnah was not very practicing. He came from a particular background that I have relatives from. I'm not going to mention the name, but they're not very practicing people, yeah, generally speaking. He came from that background, and he was very educated, went to England, etc., etc. And for him, like I said, the mantra was always, and the idea was always a united India. It was a united India. That's what he was actually going for. Until when he saw Gandhi making the independence struggle highly Hindufied. That was what kind of turned him off the whole thing, right? So, for example, there was something called the Quit India movement. So they boycotted all of the work for a couple of days. It's called Satyagaram, which is basically like anyway, so it's Hindu philosophy basically. And he was not happy with that, yeah? Not necessarily because it was anti-Muslim, because he believed in secularism, right? He believed that a secular way to govern was the best way to govern, right? And then even when you look at academic works on the period, Jinnah did not want to push he joined the All India kind of Muslim League, but he didn't want to push partition, right? Because actually his party was winning a number of seats, yeah? But he wasn't pushing partition. He actually suggested partition as a way to try and get independence quicker. The British latched onto that, right? And a big part of the British latching onto that was Kashmir, right? It was about separating and creating a volatile border. I'm going to answer the question. Sister?
Where does the IMF get the money from?
Yes.
Originally, because funded that many countries.
Yes. So the IMF has a number of, just like the UN has permanent members that fund the IMF. From the top of my head, the US, the UK. The US is the largest funder, the UK, but you can Google it. But it has permanent members, and they put money into the IMF.
They're being funded.
Yes, they're being funded.
So, IMF.
Yes.
Somebody just one day wake up and was like, I'm gonna.
No, they
No.
print the money, but in a way which doesn't create hyperinflation.
Do you mean the IMF or?
Yeah, was it like, how did it come into existence?
It came into existence during or after, once again, the Second World War, right? But a little bit later, about 1960s. And a lot of it is linked to Bretton Woods and the dropping of the dollar and et cetera, et cetera. But essentially the whole idea was that there are countries, because America said, we're going to make everybody independent and we're going to save the world, basically. Part of saving the world was that there's a lot of poor countries, so let's help you out, right? But this sat in something called globalization. America felt that a globalized world whereby it has entry into markets is the best way for the world to function, right? So corporations can basically make more money, and therefore that gets everybody richer. That's the philosophy in summary. So the IMF was a way to gain entry, ultimately, into some of these poorer countries that had a lot of natural resources. So we'll give you money, but in return, structure your economy, so they're called structural plans, structure your economy in a particular way that essentially, it was obviously wasn't sold like this, but essentially just made things even worse for them. Yeah.
You like spoke about the class system. How were people identified to like each class?
Well, a lot of it was, so there's two different ways, yeah? The first was Hinduism, right? Hinduism makes a distinction between different classes of people, right? Based on scripture and I don't know the details, yeah? So that was one way in which they did it. The other one was work, the type of work you did. But the type of work you did came later, right? Because what you had was that during colonialism and the East India Company, people were put into different jobs, right? So you weren't like an administrator because you have something great about you. You're an you're in the class of administrators because the British put you in an administrative position, right? And then, of course, people like to have some form of belonging. So therefore, they latched onto this whole idea about, I'm an administrator, right? Or if you're a landowner, and a lot of the land was actually gifted to people, yeah, in the East India Company. I'm not saying for everybody, yeah, but historically it was gifted to people, yeah. It was gifted in return for subservience, right? So if you're like, I don't know, a Chaudhry, right? You're a landowner. It's a particular, caste of people, yeah. So you're a landowner, but you could have been a landowner just because you were really good to the British and the British gave you some money, as an example. Or you could have been a landowner because you bought some land from your hard-earned cash. So it was the actual religion, Hinduism, yeah, at the time, and it was also, for example, the jobs that people do. There's a third one too, yeah, and this is an interesting one. There's an infatuation with white skin in the subcontinent. There is an infatuation with white skin, yeah, in the subcontinent, yeah. Now that's no accident, yeah. So if you study the history of the world and colonialism, etc., a lot of it is hinged on evolutionary philosophy, right? You know the whole idea about, Darwinian evolution, the fittest basically win, and if you're like this and if you're like that, you're going to get basically out-competed, yeah. So there's actually very strong documentation, right, historically, of people of the British trying to manufacture a European Indian identity amongst certain groups of Indians. That for some reason you guys, in some way, you're actually European because of historical migration routes, yeah? So some of it was just manufactured and made up, right? But once again, it fulfilled exactly the same purpose.
I asked you in the last lecture, why did Israel pull out of Gaza in 2005?
Yes, 2004. So, 5, isn't it? 5, yeah. So at that time, essentially, it had to pull out of Gaza, right? The reason why it had to pull out of Gaza was because Israel, as you can see, has a policy of not letting its civilians or its military personnel die, right? Now, what you had in Gaza, so Gaza is a strip, and the south of Gaza, you had a number of settlements, Jewish settlements, right? And there were thousands of people there, yeah? They had settled illegally there, and they were living there. They set up their houses, their families, etc., right? And in order to, and as part of, for example, international negotiation, it was, from what I remember, it was Ariel Sharon that called the withdrawal from Gaza, yeah? So you had, of course, you had Oslo, you had the second Intifada in the year 2000, right? Which is when people realized that Oslo was rubbish, yeah? And then there was a lot of pressure from international powers to get rid of settlements from Gaza, right? Because Gaza was historically promised to the Palestinians, yeah? And the trade-off was get rid of your settlements there, but carry on building your settlements elsewhere, right? So the primary reason was to carry on building settlements elsewhere. The other reason was militarily, because it was hard to manage this area of settlements across a border when these people in the settlements are surrounded by, you know, Palestinians, right? So they took them away, basically, and they gave them there.
That's the same case for the West Bank. Isn't that also settlements surrounded by Palestinians?
Yes, but those aren't illegal. I mean, in Israel's eyes, they're not illegal, if that makes sense. So from an international pressure point of view, there's no pressure for them really. So the Abraham Accords just said stop building settlements for the next 5 years. In other words, everything that's already been built is fine. Does that make, that's the distinction, yeah? And after 5 years, it's fine, carry on building them, right? But at that time it was, let's stop building in Gaza, right? Stop building in Gaza so that you can continue building in the West Bank. So they took that option and they withdrew from Gaza.
So was that what was in it for Israel?
And we see the result of that. You haven't asked the question, so, and then I'll...
I think there was a discussion earlier about cricket supporters in India, like not being Indian enough, but couldn't you argue that that doesn't really detract from a critique of Hindu nationalism? Because it's essentially saying like who gets to say that being Hindu makes you more Indian? Like you could argue a similar thing for this country, whereby like a lot of white British people grow up believing, like looking at black and brown people thinking, you're British, but you're not British, like you're not actually one of us because of your beliefs and because of how you live your life and because of your skin colour. So like, can you argue it's a similar thing in India? Like, just because people are religiously different doesn't make them less Indian.
That's, in theory, you could argue that. In practicality, it hasn't happened and it never will happen. Well, sorry, it never has happened. It's not the case and it never has happened. So you gave a good example of the British man, yeah? As in like he looks at, you know, I live in a mixed area. I've got a lot of Caucasian people that live around me. And you can feel the subtle racism, yeah? Like it's like palpable, yeah? And I've also grown up on the road, yeah? So, you know, I can clock these things quickly, right? So I can clock these things quickly, right? So, but the reality is that, you know, if you define yourself on a characteristic that makes you greater than other people, because that's what nationalism is, yeah? You're defining yourself on a characteristic that you have inherently within yourself, or you feel, language, skin color, culture, that is better than other people. That mind frame will always carry on. And I'm not saying there are people that have not risen beyond that, because there are lots of people that are, you know, very good. Yeah, there are lots of people in Britain, there are lots of people in France, etc. I'm sure there are lots of people that are beyond those stereotypes, etc. But the reality is that the philosophy is built on this, right? Nationalistic philosophy is built. That's why the natural outcome, or the most extreme outcome of it, has always been things like BJP, Nazism, Zionism. You know, it's the natural end of nationalism. It's the truest form of nationalism, right? So, does that answer the question, Insha'Allah?
Post-partition,
100%. It's always been nationalist, right? It's always been nationalist.
You mentioned of Pakistan never known like where it wants to go. As individuals, how would we route like the course forward?
I think it's a good question, and I feel that's my take on it. I feel that's the problem, and I always feel that you've got to diagnose the problem before thinking about a solution. Otherwise, you become like a rocking chair who just rocks but doesn't move, right? So it's like I said. I gave that example of the stock exchange, etc. It's about doing a root cause analysis, just like you would do with business, just like you would do with any other issue. You would have to do a root cause analysis. You have to look at, okay, look, what is the skill set of the people? What is the heritage of the people? Where do the emotions of the people lie? Where are the ideas and thoughts of the people lie, right? And then subsequently, you got to go with something. You got to therefore move on that basis, not necessarily, you know, what does this person think is best for me, right? Or what is the flavor of the month or the flavor of the year, right? It has to be organic. I know it's really abstract, but
No, that makes sense.
yeah.
How much do you think the military being able to come in whenever they want plays a role in that?
Massive. The biggest, you know, you have to, like, structurally, look, Pakistan is just like the same as Egypt. Yeah, it's the same example, right? It's a very good book written by Aisha Siddiqa. It's called Military Inc. Yeah, it demonstrates how the army is not just an army. The army owns swathes of land within Pakistan, right? Swathes of land. It's the same with the Egyptian army. The banks, the media agencies, property, you know, for example, in like new capital cities, etc., etc. It's like, so it is the biggest barrier, right? It is the biggest barrier.
You mentioned before that it's like really important for a country to identify what its resources are to colonize beyond like colonial control. Are there any examples in history of a country being able to kind of like escape the post-colonial period, like the grip that America or Britain has or France has?
You know, sadly, it's a difficult one, because there are definitely countries that have driven out, you know, attempts, for example, of colonizers to colonize lands. So, for example, you know, Vietnam is one. Yeah. For example, Afghanistan is a very recent one, right? The difficulty is seeing beyond that, because the moment you come out, you get stepped back in, right? You get forced back in, right? And that's why it's an interesting space, because there are Muslim thinkers, as an example, existent throughout the world, yeah? I gave an institution like Ummatics, for instance, yeah? That are thinking about how do you step out and how do you stay out? And the issue is, you know, you mentioned a few, sister, as well. It's not just, you know, UN, IMF, it's interest-based banking system, it's fiat currency, it's foreign exchange, it's the dollar, it's lots of different areas, right? And you can see when people try to set up an alternative or step out, like China, as an example, you know, there's every effort made to maintain the world order. So I'm afraid I can't really answer that question. But inshallah, one day. I'm still learning like you guys are, so.
India is called Hindustan, isn't it? So
I guess so.
they view it like that, don't they? They view it like the land of the Hindus.
Yeah, correct.
I would say Turkey's trying to increase its economic output and isn't really signing.
Turkey is still stuck. But there is one thing with Erdogan, is that he has a clear translatable project. That's the difference between him and Imran Khan. No matter what his criticisms are, I can be very critical of Turkey, by the way, but the difference is, and that's why sincerity doesn't make you a good politician or the best politician. You have to have political wit. Yeah. So, for example, Erdogan is a very good case study of how the army was an institution that was not under his control, to then actually protecting him in the 2014 military coup. Right? 2014. No, Ramadan 2015, 16. One of the two. But the military coup, if you remember. So he had 4 battalions. One of them turned against him, and the other 3 protected him. He played the long game. And in addition to that, he had a clear translatable project. But he's a good example of that. Yeah, I have more to say, but it's okay. Yeah.
I had a question. You know on the slides you put...
Oh, I'll come back to you.
On the slides you put Mihna of Imam Ahmed. I didn't really understand what that was.
So that was a very tumultuous time in Islamic history, when you had... And this is a point that is... I'm not going to go into the details of that, but a lot of the sects in Islam, theological sects that you had, came about as a result of political differences. Right? Came about as a result of political differences. Even, for example, earlier sects, such as the Qadiriyya and the Jabariyya, as an example, right? And the Mu'tazila, even, you know, later on. Even, for example, you know, Barelvi and the Ubendi. Yeah? There's loads of different examples, yeah? The Mihna was a very important point in history, whereby you had a particular issue that happened with Harun al-Rashid, and he appointed 2 successors. He appointed one in Khurasan and one in Baghdad. And then what you had was that the guy in Khurasan killed the one in Baghdad, and Ma'mun. And essentially he was very much influenced and supported by a theological grouping called the Mu'tazila, right? Yeah, I mean, I don't like calling them the rationalists, yeah? Some of these brothers will know why, but they're not rational thinkers, yeah? They're not the rationalists, yeah? But it's a deeper discussion. But they coerced al-Ma'mun to make the Mu'tazila school of theology an official school of theology within the Abbasid period. That was problematic, right? Because the extreme versions of them held some problematic positions. And Imam Ahmad, rahmatullah alayh, held incredibly steadfast to that and managed to fight that. It's actually a very good NBC program called Imam Ahmad. Mehen. Ustaz. Qul li habibi. Mehna. I know the meaning, but it's like imtahana, it's like test. Yeah. It's like, sorry? Hardship, like mahana is like to struggle. Mahana, yeah, so mihna. So another one is imtahana or imtihan in Urdu. La, mumkin? No? Imtihan, yeah. Imtihan, to test, right? So it's the same thing.
There's like no social media presence in Kashmir at all. Is there like a push propaganda within Kashmir? Is there a narrative like India's trying to push on? Or are they just waiting on that vote, or they just help us out? Or
Yeah. There is social media presence, but it can be curbed. But you're going to go for it.
I was actually going to say, I would say Pakistan are almost equally as complicit as India in the Kashmir situation.
100%.
As someone who's been studying this for years, and so to do with my dissertation, which obviously after all everything, I was recently with academics and historians in Birmingham, not too many months ago, with regards to the Indians in Kashmir. Obviously, I've come from, I guess what we call Kashmir, from America, not the actual ethnic Kashmiris in the party, but sorry, what was your question again? No, about Kashmir.
Can I expand? Yeah.
So,
go on.
With the actual internet shutdown in the Indian occupied Kashmir is the only thing that's actually visible. You have other areas where in the Pakistani occupied part of Kashmir where electricity and resources are scarce because some military generals within Pakistan there would also have quite high say how things go, and especially at the land grabbing and the forced disappearances of people within Pakistani occupied Kashmir, especially like the coercion and the indoctrination of many young lads around about my age who actually taught to them quite fluently over there. So it's not really like although in Indian occupied Kashmir, the reason why the vote hasn't gone down is because the only difference is that India is a lot more aggressive than Pakistan, whereas that Pakistan wants to slide things under the rug. So, I mean, the large majority of Muslims in Britain are actually Kashmiri. Because long story short, obviously I speak to the elders and say stuff like, obviously our lands were flooded because some sort of dam which put electricity into their country, and we lot were given us lot were given a middle finger. So when we came to this country, we were already ostracised. We were already displaced and marginalised. Not only over there, not only over here, but also over there as well. Because you still do see that a massive array of Indian students harassing and beating up Kashmiri students and mobs. We also see that in the South Kashmiris who end up going to Pakistan, they get verbally and physically corrected over there. Also, it is quite nuanced, but I don't think. I mean, Kashmir is the easiest solution in the Ummah to fix, in my opinion, right? Because obviously you do have other monstrosities against humanity, like the Uyghurs, the Burmese, what they're called?
Rohingyans.
You've got the Yemenis, which is quite bad. But I personally don't believe, and I've been speaking to the academics in the things in Birmingham, and those, all them soldiers over there back in Kashmir, they literally don't see Kashmir ever being free. Unless it's under Pakistan or India.
I think, oh yeah, sorry.
Is there a representative to fight back?
No,
on each side?
Not on each side, they've been killed off.
Can I interrupt? I think the Ustad wanted to say something, so I'm just going to...
No, it's okay. I think I completely agree with the first point the brother made. It's not just an Indian, it's not just the Indians that made the problem. Like I said, the reality was that the issue, the Kashmir question, should have been decided during partition. That's the issue. That's the point that I made. Yeah, regardless. Sorry. No, so it should have been decided during the partition. Yeah, just like every other region was decided during partition. However, it was not decided during partition, right? And what you had was and Kashmir fulfilled that purpose from that point of view, yeah? And like I said, it's the Kashmiri lives that are lost, yeah? But, you know, they say the house always wins, right? It continues to be, you know, a perpetually unstable border between India and Pakistan. And you continue to see it today. And Pakistan are just as complicit from the point of view of, for a number of reasons, yeah? Well, one of the reasons is that they've given up on the Kashmir issue. Right? You know when you say we're going to go back to the UN resolution, right? It's been ages, man. That UN resolution has not done anything. But when Imran Khan comes out and says we're concerned about the brothers and people in Kashmir, we call upon the UN resolution, right? Just like whenever, for example, in the Palestinian issue, somebody says we're going to look out for UN resolution 181. It basically means we're going to wash our hands of the situation, right? In addition to that, absolutely right, and the brothers are also right from another point of view. And this relates to, you know, sectarianization, what you identify yourself as, what is the basis upon which you are establishing your country on, right? If it's on ethnic lines, right, how are you going to accept anybody? It's the same in India, right? Hinduism, right? It's the same with Zionism, like the lateral, sorry. Yeah, we will do, inshallah. The natural end of nationalism is the destruction and exploitation of people. And the same thing happened with Kashmiris. And the brothers are absolutely right. So the Kashmiri population, Azad Kashmir was annexed, yeah? And then you had people who were largely, generally speaking, yeah, not necessarily accepted into the mainstream of society, right? Because they were seen as ethnically different.
They never
right?
wanted to be a part of Pakistan. They were sympathetic to the idea of
yes,
Pakistan,
correct.
but they never wanted to be
correct. So, and they got treated as such, right? And Pakistan still suffers from that, right? Because Pakistan has a number of different quadrants of different people. The Sindhis feel, for example, so my family in Karachi, yeah, are part of my family. The Sindhis feel that the Punjabis don't care about them, right? The Balochis feel that the Sindhis don't even know who they are, and it's true. Right? Don't know who they are, right? And the Punjabis are like, everybody else is getting out to get us, right?
The thing with the Kashmiris is that
it's problematic.
No, I do apologize, but like
you don't really do. I'll give you.
The person that's actually been killed off was actually called for independence. I just want to say I'm not a nationalist. I'm not a patriot. I don't agree with nationalism unless it's at the Olympics or the World Cup or something. But yeah, like the Kashmir issue will never get solved, and yeah.
It's because the powers don't want it to get solved.
Plus,
fulfills its, and the only person that suffers is the Ajmer Kashmiri. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help all of our brothers and sisters in this ummah, inshallah. Inshallah, we'll call it a day.